Shalom, Shavua Tov. The storm that has been raging across Iceland for the last 6 days has finally died down enough for me to record a video without fearing that the power is going to cut out halfway through, which has been like a new feature of my year. Along with a slight inflection in how I talk, which I was going to make a separate video on in light of the whole Hilaria Baldwin, huge, very complex debates about cultural appropriation and identity and the desire to kind of like out someone for who they really are in an era where we all kind of shift and change and adapt in a very like complex globalized world. But the too long didn't read version is I'm not pretending to be Icelandic. I've just picked up a voice somewhat akin to Rachel McAdams pretending to be Icelandic in the Will Ferrell Fire Saga movie by virtue of the fact that I've been hanging around with Icelandic people for a year, and a product of me growing up in many different places and living many different places is that I inadvertently pick up accents, and very often my English just gets worse far more than my knowledge of the second language gets better. So if I have a slight inflection in the videos that I've been making while I've been in Iceland, it's not a kind of cultural appropriation of Icelandic people, and I'm very sensitive to all of those incredibly complex debates about who can speak for who and who gets to claim what heritage, and have had thousands of conversations about those like any person who reads newspapers and lives in the world. I just have this like slightly garbled accent at the moment, which will probably fade when I return to the United Kingdom, because that's also one of the things about accents is they're not boundary discrete things. They shift and change over time. So speaking of change, this is a very short video to make an announcement that I've added a language to my language roster because of a change in my circumstances, which is that there may have just been a slight power cut. These blizzards, okay, they run my life. I've added a language to my language roster by virtue of the fact that I'm now very lucky to be spending a lot of time with Yiddish speakers, which is actually not something I've really had in my life before, despite my my time in Israel and when I was a university student in the UK. One of my very close friends was an academic of Yiddish, which was very interesting. And when I lived in Tel Aviv, I took some very, very basic intro courses to Yiddish, but none of that really stuck because my brain was too busy like absorbing the like Quebecois French of my surroundings and trying to get Arabic into my head in 5 lessons a week. That was super, super intense. So this is a new language for me, and I thought I'd make a quick video about it because I'm going to track my progress on learning Yiddish as someone who's spent a few years learning Hebrew, and what that's like. As obviously Yiddish and Hebrew come from completely different language families. One is Semitic, one is Indo-European, of a Germanic base. They're both obviously historically bound up with Judaism, but Yiddish being a really fascinating, important literary language for a lot of European history, and Hebrew having gone through a very sort of unique, sui generis revival from the late 19th century, but then also in official format since 1948. And the two have a very interesting dynamic and interplay with one another. Of course, it's very politicized, very loaded, like who speaks which language when. I know there's a really fascinating stuff and work I've been doing on constitution formation in the first Israeli Congress, where they, who spoke what language when was a signifier, as these things so often are. But I'm just learning it because it's a lovely, fascinating language. I have been putting off learning Yiddish for a very long time on the basis that my Hebrew is really bad and my German is really bad. So I know this isn't what Yiddish is, but this is where my kind of like lizard brain was at. I was like, so if I learn something that's a mush of the two, it's going to end really, really, really badly. So I was postponing learning Yiddish. I think I assumed that I would only get to it when my Hebrew is fluent. My Hebrew is still not fluent, although I'm going to post an update on my year of Hebrew tuition. And I now use my Hebrew pretty much every day in in one form or another, my modern Hebrew. So one thing that I've been finding really interesting, that I've been struggling with, but has been really interesting, was how to relearn the Hebrew alphabet, what I understand is the Hebrew alphabet, as Yiddish speakers know it. So I downloaded this app, which is just called Teach Yourself Yiddish. I can put a link to it, that has goes through all the alphabet again with the Yiddish names, so the Pashek Aleph, the Chometz Aleph, okay, Bet, Zez, Hez, Gimel, Dalet, okay, these are the same, and talks through how, this, these things are new for Hebrew speakers, how these words are pronounced in Yiddish and how they're used to render the Yiddish Yiddish pronunciation, which has been really interesting and quite surprising. And the other thing that I found really interesting, as I've been having these Yiddish classes just once a week, is realizing I knew more German than I thought I did, which was quite cool, because I normally assume that I don't recall any language. I lived in Berlin in my early 20s when I was working for an anti-corruption NGO, and the language of the organization was English and French, and I was still learning my Arabic quite a lot during that time, and I think that I was very hard on myself about how terrible my German, how very, very bad my German was. And I've always almost defined myself as someone who doesn't speak German, as kind of a binary relationship. But I realized how much German I've absorbed as I'm learning the grammar of Yiddish, which was very cool. I wonder whether, because the fact that I've been learning Icelandic, which is a North Germanic language, has kind of fed into that, because the structure is the same. So many people here always say, oh, well, if you knew German, then Icelandic would be easier. And then I've spoken to German speakers and they're like, nah. So that's a debate about Icelandic, about whether German really kind of helps you, is really like an inroad into the Icelandic language. But anyway, as I'm learning Yiddish, I was like, okay, yeah, I remember these structures, these structures I'd obviously absorbed by process of osmosis. So that's been really cool. That's been really interesting. And then the last thing I just wanted to note, super briefly, about in my little exercises, is what a beautiful testament to Jewish cultural richness the Yiddish language is, because I've come across Slavic words, I've come across Semitic words, I've come across words from Romance languages, and so many different this very specific word. I was just I think I came across that in my teach myself Polish. My Polish is also very bad, but different tributaries of linguistic heritage that kind of manifest in Yiddish, and how lovely it is. And so I'm really glad I'm finally giving this language the due that it deserves, the attention it deserves, because I think I often kind of considered it a kind of on the back burner, because for my life I need the big global languages of now, the Arabic and Russian and these kinds of things, and there is very complex cultural signifier of what does it mean to be a person who knows Yiddish, that can become very charged. In the different worlds in which I move, people have very different responses to what that means, from that's the language of my grandmother, to well, no, if we spoke that language that would associate us with these people and we're these people. So all of those kind of cultural connotations, the complexities of what language means in complex social realities, and I'm trying to not engage with that too much. It's made me want to really revisit a lot of the literature that I was so like immersed in when I was in Montreal, because I remember one of the things there that was so fascinating was like the Yiddish literary traditions and then the Francophone literary traditions, and how they weren't kind of speaking to each other until Michel Tremblay kind of like, you know, his play in the 80s that kind of brought the two together. And then you have the Francophone community and the Yiddish community not being kind of mediated via the Anglophone centre, which is like really kind of fascinating a development in kind of Montreal life. But yeah, it's great, and just the poetry is so beautiful as well. So that's another language that I've added to my to my list. I realize I may be giving the impression from these that I just keep starting languages but not actually following through on anything, like a little butterfly just like hopping from flower to flower. That might be a little bit true, and that's something that I'm trying to work on in myself, which is why I'm like returning to languages that I learned a long time ago. But also I'm not hurting anyone. And also I do find that they do end up feeding into one another, which is really great. And I'm hoping that there will be occasions later in the year for social reasons that I'll get to use my Yiddish quite a lot. So I'll make a video after that has happened, because I'll be really curious to know, like in 6 months' time, if I'm hanging out with a bunch of Yiddish speakers, how they react and respond to my nascent Yiddish. So yeah, that's my little my update of the day. And yes, thank you to Icelandic Weather for not cutting out the power for an entire 11 minutes for me to make this video.